The Texas sun beats down mercilessly on the dusty ground as the train's wheels screech against steel rails, finally grinding to a halt. It's August 15th, 1943, and 22-year-old Fritz Haus steps off the passenger coach, not a cattle car, but an actual upholstered passenger coach, onto American soil for the first time. His weathered Afrika Korps uniform hangs loose on his frame, the desert campaigns having stripped away both weight and illusions. Fritz shields his eyes against the blazing heat, expecting to see the bombed-out ruins that German propaganda had promised him. Instead, he stares at endless farmland stretching toward the horizon, punctuated by buildings that show no signs of war damage. The other prisoners around him mutter in disbelief. Where are the craters from Luftwaffe bombing raids? Where are the starving American civilians they'd been told about? Mein Gott, Fritz whispers under his breath, watching American guards distribute bottles of ice-cold Coca-Cola to the exhausted prisoners. One guard, barely older than Fritz himself, offers him a cigarette with a smile that seems almost friendly. This isn't what Fritz had been prepared for during his 2 years fighting Rommel's Desert War. He'd expected execution, or at minimum, brutal revenge for the damage Germany had inflicted across Europe. Instead, the American chaplain who'd spoken to them on the train had explained something that still doesn't make sense. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Same food as our soldiers, same medical care, same opportunities for education and recreation. Education, recreation. Fritz had laughed at the time, assuming it was some cruel American joke. Now, as the camp gates of Hearne, Texas swing open before him, Fritz feels something he hasn't experienced since his capture in North Africa: genuine confusion. The guard towers and barbed wire remind him this is still a prison, but the prisoners walking freely within the compounds, some carrying books, others tending elaborate gardens, challenge everything he thought he knew about American brutality. A German sergeant approaches, one of the earlier arrivals who'd been captured in Tunisia. "Welcome to the Fritz Ritz," he says with bitter sarcasm, though Fritz notices the man has gained considerable weight and his uniform is cleaner than it ever was in the desert. "What did you call it?" Fritz asks. "That's what the American newspapers call it. They think we're being pampered." The sergeant gestures toward a group of prisoners carrying surveying equipment. Those men are taking engineering courses, taught by professors from Baylor University. Can you believe that? The Americans are educating their enemies. Fritz stares at the scene before him, his worldview beginning to crack like dried mud in the desert sun. Everything the Nazi propaganda machine had told him about American savagery, about democratic weakness, about the inferiority of non-Aryan peoples, none of it matches what his eyes are telling him. How could his Führer have been so wrong about America? And more terrifyingly, what else might he have been wrong about? The first weeks at Camp Hearne shatter Fritz's understanding of warfare, captivity, and his enemies piece by piece. Each morning brings new impossibilities that challenge 2 decades of Nazi indoctrination. At 0600 hours, reveille sounds across the compound, but instead of harsh American commands, Fritz hears German voices, prisoners organizing themselves according to familiar military hierarchy. The NCOs from his old Afrika Korps unit maintain discipline, conduct inspections, and preserve the rigid structure that had defined his entire adult life. For brief moments, surrounded by German voices and military protocol, Fritz can almost forget he's thousands of miles from the fatherland. But then breakfast arrives, and reality crashes back. Heaping portions of bacon, eggs, pancakes with real maple syrup, fresh fruit, and coffee that doesn't taste like roasted acorns. Fritz stares at his plate, remembering the thin gruel and moldy bread that had been their standard rations during the final months in North Africa. One meal here contains more protein than he'd seen in a week during Rommel's retreat. Unglaublich, mutters Klaus Zimmermann, a machine gunner from Frankfurt, as he examines an orange. I haven't seen fruit like this since 1939. The abundance extends beyond food. The camp canteen stocks cigarettes, candy bars, shaving cream, and even beer. American beer, but beer nonetheless. Fritz watches in amazement as prisoners purchase items that had been luxury fantasies back home. The camp script system, earning money for work performed, means these aren't gifts, but wages. The Americans are paying their enemies to work. But nothing prepares Fritz for what happens on his third Tuesday in camp. A convoy of civilian automobiles arrives at the main gate. Fritz watches through the fence as well-dressed men and women carry briefcases and books toward the camp's recreation hall. American civilians entering a prison camp voluntarily. Who are they? Fritz asks Werner Voll, a veteran prisoner who'd arrived months earlier. Professors, Werner replies with a mixture of awe and disbelief. From Baylor University. They come twice a week to teach classes. Teach what? Whatever we want to learn. Engineering, mathematics, literature, theology, business administration. Werner shakes his head. I'm taking accounting courses. When I return to Germany, I'll have certification recognized by German universities. Fritz feels a familiar sensation, the same vertigo that had hit him when American artillery found their positions in Tunisia. The world is shifting beneath his feet in ways he cannot control or comprehend. That evening, curiosity overwhelms caution. Fritz approaches the recreation hall where bright electric lights illuminate rows of German prisoners hunched over textbooks and notebooks. Professor James Mitchell, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stands at a makeshift blackboard explaining calculus problems in broken German, supplemented by mathematical symbols that transcend language barriers. The scene defies every propaganda poster Fritz had ever seen. These weren't American demons torturing German soldiers. This was voluntary education being provided to enemy combatants by citizens of the nation Germany had declared war against. In the back row, Fritz recognizes Obergefreiter Heinrich Weiss, a former Hitler youth leader whose fanatical speeches had inspired Fritz during their darkest desert battles. Now, Heinrich scribbles notes frantically, completely absorbed in learning American engineering principles. Herr Professor, Heinrich raises his hand with the same enthusiasm he'd once shown for Nazi rallies. Could you explain again how American factories achieve such production efficiency? Professor Mitchell smiles, actually smiles at a German soldier, and launches into an explanation about assembly line innovations and industrial management techniques. Fritz realizes he's witnessing something unprecedented, willing collaboration between enemies in pursuit of knowledge. After class, Fritz confronts Heinrich outside the barracks. How can you sit there learning from them? They're our enemies. Heinrich's response rocks Fritz to his core. Fritz, look around. Really look. Everything we were told about Americans, that they're weak, degenerate, that their democracy makes them inferior. Where's the evidence? They're feeding us better than our own army ever did. They're educating us when they could simply warehouse us until the war ends. They're treating us with more humanity than... Heinrich stops, the dangerous thought hanging unfinished in the desert air. Then what? Fritz presses. Then we treated prisoners. Heinrich's voice drops to a whisper. Fritz, I was at Stalingrad before Africa. I saw how we treated Russian prisoners. I saw what happened to the Jews in Poland before I shipped out. What we did. The silence stretches between them, heavy with implications neither man wants to confront. That night, Fritz lies awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Through the window, he can see American guards in their towers, reading newspapers or writing letters home. Not monsters, not demons. just young men like himself, caught up in a war they didn't start. Outside, a German prisoner practices violin, music that would have been forbidden as degenerate back home. The melody drifts across the compound, beautiful and melancholy, while American guards listen without interference. Fritz closes his eyes, but sleep won't come. For the first time since his capture, he's beginning to understand that his imprisonment might not be the worst thing that could have happened to him. It might be the thing that saves his soul. October 12th, 1943. The moment that will haunt Fritz Haus for the rest of his life begins with something as mundane as a university registration form. Professor Mitchell approaches Fritz after the evening mathematics session, holding a manila folder thick with official documents. Herr Haus, your test scores are exceptional. I'd like to recommend you for our advanced engineering program. Fritz examines the papers with trembling hands. Baylor University letterhead. Texas A&M University course catalogs. Official transcripts that will be recognized by German universities after the war. His name, Fritz Haus, enemy prisoner of war. Serial number 31, G-10847, listed alongside American students as if he were just another scholar pursuing knowledge. I don't understand, Fritz whispers. Why would you do this? I'm your enemy. Professor Mitchell removes his glasses, cleaning them with deliberate care. Son, knowledge doesn't recognize national boundaries. Mathematics works the same way in Germany as it does in Texas. If you want to learn, I want to teach. It's that simple. But Fritz knows it's not simple at all. Nothing about this place is simple. That evening, he sits in his bunk studying calculus. While around him, other prisoners engage in activities that would have been unthinkable months ago. Klaus practices English with an American guard who's helping him write letters to his sister in Hamburg. Werner reviews business administration texts, preparing for examinations that will qualify him as a certified accountant. Heinrich works on an engineering project that will actually improve the camp's water system, a German prisoner designing infrastructure improvements for his American captors. The transformation isn't limited to academics. The compound buzzes with creative energy. Prisoners have built elaborate fountains and gardens that rival anything Fritz saw in Berlin's parks. The theater group performs Shakespeare translated into German, while American guards and local townspeople buy tickets to attend. The camp orchestra, featuring instruments provided by the YMCA, practices Beethoven symphonies under the Texas stars. Fritz watches it all with growing amazement and terror. Terror because he's beginning to realize the magnitude of the lies he's lived under his entire life. On October 20th, everything changes forever. A new transport arrives from Italy, German prisoners who'd been captured during the collapse of Mussolini's government. Among them is Hauptmann Klaus Richter, a Waffen SS officer whose black uniform marks him as one of Hitler's elite. Fritz recognizes the type immediately, the true believers who'd made life hell for anyone showing insufficient Nazi enthusiasm. Richter takes one look at the camp's educational programs and explodes in fury. Schande! He screams at the prisoners attending evening classes. Shame! You disgrace the uniform. You learn from our enemies while German cities burn under Allied bombs. That night, Richter organizes a kangaroo court in Barracks 7. Fritz watches in horror as the scene unfolds, a grotesque parody of Nazi racial courts, but now judging German prisoners for the crime of learning. Heinrich stands before Richter, still clutching his engineering textbooks. I've committed no crime. The Geneva Convention guarantees. The Geneva Convention is for weaklings, Richter snarls. True Germans don't collaborate with Jewish-controlled democracies. What happens next occurs in slow motion, seared forever into Fritz's memory. Richter nods to his SS cronies. They produce metal pipes. pieces of camp plumbing they'd torn from a washroom. The beating is methodical, brutal, designed to send a message to every prisoner considering American education. Heinrich's screams echo across the compound until they stop abruptly. The silence that follows is deafening. Fritz stands frozen outside the barracks, his calculus textbook clutched against his chest like armor that cannot protect him. Inside, Richter's voice continues, "This is what happens to race traitors. Any prisoner caught attending American classes will receive the same justice." The American guards never hear the commotion. The camp's perimeter system keeps them isolated in their towers, unaware of the Nazi terror unfolding behind the barbed wire. By morning, Heinrich is dead. The camp's first and only fatality, killed not by Americans, but by his own countrymen for the crime of learning. The aftermath splits the camp into warring factions. Richter's SS loyalists control the barracks through intimidation and violence. The educational programs continue, but now prisoners attend in secret, knowing they risk their lives for the privilege of learning American engineering or studying democratic philosophy. Fritz faces an impossible choice: continue his studies and risk Heinrich's fate, or abandon the intellectual awakening that's begun to free his mind from 20 years of Nazi indoctrination. On November 3rd, he makes his decision. Professor Mitchell finds Fritz waiting outside the recreation hall at dawn, textbooks under his arm despite the obvious dangers. "Son, you don't have to risk this. We could arrange private tutoring sessions." "No," Fritz interrupts. "If I hide, then Richter wins. Heinrich died because he refused to live in ignorance. I won't dishonor his memory by choosing fear over knowledge." Fritz enters the classroom knowing he might not leave alive. Other prisoners stare at him with mixtures of admiration and terror. Everyone understands what this moment represents: a final rejection of Nazi ideology in favor of something far more dangerous: independent thought. As Professor Mitchell begins the evening's lesson on structural engineering, Fritz feels the weight of watching eyes from the compound outside. Richter's supporters are noting who attends, who chooses knowledge over ideology, who dares to believe that learning from enemies might be more valuable than dying for lies. The lecture proceeds in tense quiet, each prisoner hyper-aware that they're participating in an act of rebellion more profound than any military resistance. They're not just defying camp authority, they're defying an entire worldview that has defined their nation for over a decade. When class ends, Fritz walks back to his barracks knowing he's crossed a line he can never uncross. Tomorrow he might face Richter's justice, but tonight he understands something Heinrich died trying to grasp. Education is the ultimate act of resistance against tyranny. Behind him, Professor Mitchell locks the classroom, unaware that he's just witnessed a young German soldier's first step toward reclaiming his humanity from the ideology that had nearly destroyed it. In the guard towers, American sentries continue their monotonous patrols, oblivious to the revolution of conscience occurring beneath their watch. Inside the barbed wire, two versions of Germany are at war, one clinging to hatred and ignorance, the other reaching desperately toward knowledge and redemption. Fritz knows which side he's chosen. The question now is whether he'll live long enough to see its victory. Fritz Haus survived Camp Hearne. More importantly, he survived the war that raged within its barbed wire fences, the battle between education and ignorance, between humanity and ideology, between the Germany that was and the Germany that could be. By war's end in 1945, Fritz had completed 2 years of engineering courses that American universities formally recognized. His transcript, stamped with both Baylor University and Texas A&M letterheads, represented more than academic achievement. It documented the transformation of a Nazi soldier into a democratic citizen. The statistics tell part of the story. Over 425,000 German prisoners lived in American camps during World War II. Thousands attended university-level courses. Hundreds earned degrees that launched post-war careers in engineering, business, theology, and education. But numbers cannot capture the magnitude of what really occurred in places like Camp Hearne. Fritz returned to a devastated Germany in 1946, carrying more than textbooks in his worn duffel bag. He carried proof that democracy wasn't weakness, that education wasn't privilege, that former enemies could become teachers and friends. In the ruins of Hamburg, he established one of Germany's first post-war engineering consulting firms, using American techniques learned behind Texas barbed wire. More remarkably, Fritz became part of Germany's re-education generation, former POWs who used their American experiences to rebuild their nation's democratic institutions. They founded universities, wrote new textbooks, and taught young Germans that strength came not from blind obedience, but from informed choice. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual lives. Camp Hearne and similar facilities conducted history's most successful prisoner rehabilitation program. While Soviet camps in Siberia broke spirits through brutality, American camps rebuilt them through education. The contrast wasn't lost on Germans who experienced both systems, or on the world watching the Cold War's competing ideologies play out. Klaus Zimmermann, the machine gunner who'd marveled at American oranges, became a successful businessman who helped establish West Germany's democratic labor unions. Werner Voll used his accounting training to become a government auditor, ensuring transparent financial practices in Germany's new democratic institutions. Even some of Richter's SS followers eventually attended classes, their fanaticism slowly eroded by exposure to forbidden knowledge. The camp's educational programs faced constant challenges from Nazi hardliners, but Professor Mitchell and his colleagues never stopped teaching. They understood something profound. Winning the war meant more than defeating German armies. It meant winning German minds. Heinrich Weiss's death wasn't meaningless. His sacrifice became a rallying point for prisoners choosing education over ideology. Each man who attended classes despite the risk honored Heinrich's memory and advanced his cause. By 1944, even dedicated Nazis began questioning whether knowledge could truly be treason. The broader historical implications are staggering. America's treatment of German POWs helped lay the groundwork for NATO alliance, democratic reconstruction, and eventual reconciliation between former enemies. Men who'd been educated in American prison camps became architects of West Germany's economic miracle and staunch allies during the Cold War. Today, as democratic institutions face new challenges, the Camp Hearne story offers crucial lessons. Education remains the most powerful weapon against extremism. Treating enemies with humanity can transform them into allies. Knowledge transcends national boundaries, ideological differences, and historical grievances. Fritz Haus lived until 1998, long enough to see German reunification and his homeland's full integration into democratic Europe. In his final interview, he reflected on those transformative months in Texas. The Americans didn't just win the war, they won the peace by refusing to let hatred triumph over hope. They saw potential in their enemies and invested in our futures. That's why Germany became their ally instead of their permanent adversary. The lesson resonates across decades. In our interconnected world, yesterday's enemies often become tomorrow's partners. The investments we make in human potential, even in the darkest circumstances, determine whether conflicts end in lasting peace or generational hatred. Camp Hearne's barbed wire has long since rusted away, but its true monument endures in the democratic values that former prisoners carried back to Germany and passed on to new generations. Fritz Haus couldn't believe America would educate its enemies. By doing exactly that, America transformed both its enemies and itself. Ready to explore more hidden stories from World War II? Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because history's most powerful lessons often come from the places we least expect to find them.